Sometimes those you trust most hurt you the deepest. 72-year-old rancher Silas Vance learned this when his nephews drove him into the Devil's Anvil Desert during a sandstorm, leaving him to die with his old horse, Rusty. They wanted his land and figured the storm would finish the job. But Silas refused to quit. When starving coyotes circled through the night, he stood guard with a makeshift torch, protecting his faithful animal until dawn. When the sun rose and the storm cleared, what Silas found buried in the sand didn't just save his life. It made him the richest man in the state. What could a deadly sandstorm uncover that would turn a dying cowboy into a millionaire? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Vance Ranch sat in a valley where the morning light came late and the evening shadows arrived early, nestled between two red rock ridges that had stood watch over the land for longer than any man could remember. Silas Vance had worked this earth for 47 years, ever since he'd married Martha, and they'd scraped together enough money to buy the place from old Jeremiah Hoskins. The ranch house itself was modest. Weathered cedar siding that had turned silver gray under decades of sun and wind. A wide porch that sagged slightly on the south end, and a roof that Silas had patched more times than he could count. But it was home, and that meant something. On this particular morning, 3 weeks before everything would change, Silas stood in the barn doorway watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, rested on the worn handle of a pitchfork. Those hands had mended thousands of fences, delivered countless calves, and held his wife's hand through 31 years of marriage before cancer took her 5 years ago. He still wore his wedding band, a simple gold circle that had grown thin with time. The barn smelled of hay and leather and horse, a smell that had become as familiar to Silas as his own breathing. Dust motes danced in the slanting light, and somewhere in the rafters, barn swallows called to their young. This was the world he understood. A world of simple rhythms and honest work, where a man's word meant something and a handshake sealed a deal. "Morning, old friend," Silas said, making his way to the fourth stall where Rusty stood, head lowered over the feed trough. The horse was a 23-year-old quarter horse, rust-colored as his name suggested, with a white blaze down his face and 3 white socks. He'd been Martha's horse originally, the one she'd ridden when they'd go out to check the fence lines together. After she passed, Silas had kept Rusty close, unable to part with one of the last living connections to his wife. Rusty lifted his head at Silas's approach, ears forward. The horse had developed a limp in his right front leg about 6 months ago. Arthritis, the vet had said. Common in older horses. Nothing to be done about it except keep him comfortable and limit his work. Silas ran his hand down Rusty's neck, feeling the warmth of the animal's body, the solid presence that had carried him through so many days on this land. "You and me both getting on in years," Silas murmured, pulling a sugar cube from his shirt pocket. Rusty's soft lips tickled his palm as the horse took the treat. "But we've still got some time left in us, don't we?" The sound of tires on gravel interrupted the morning's peace. Silas looked toward the house and saw a black pickup truck pulling into the yard, one he recognized immediately. His jaw tightened. Raymond and Carl, his sister's boys, coming to visit. They'd been showing up more frequently in recent months, always with suggestions about how he should run the place, always with that tone in their voices that said they thought he was too old to make his own decisions. Silas left the barn and walked toward the house, moving with the careful gait of a man whose knees remembered every fall from a horse, every day spent in the saddle. He was tall still, though not as tall as he'd been in his youth. His shoulders had rounded slightly with age, but there was still strength in his frame. The kind of strength that came from a lifetime of physical labor. Raymond climbed out of the driver's side, a thick-set man in his early 40s with thinning hair and a gut that hung over his belt. Carl emerged from the passenger side, younger by 2 years, leaner with sharp features and eyes that never seemed to settle on any one thing for long. Both wore clean jeans and boots that had never seen a day of real work, and both had that same look on their faces that Silas had come to dread. A mixture of false concern and barely concealed impatience. "Uncle Silas," Raymond called out, voice too loud for the quiet morning. "Hope we're not catching you at a bad time." "I was tending to Rusty," Silas said, stopping a few feet from the truck. He didn't offer coffee or invite them inside. They'd invite themselves soon enough. Still keeping that lame horse around? Carl said, shaking his head. Man, you need to make some practical decisions. That animal's just eating feed and taking up space. Silas felt heat rise in his chest but kept his voice level. Rusty's earned his keep 10 times over. He'll stay as long as I'm here. Raymond shot his brother a look, then turned back to Silas with what was probably meant to be a sympathetic smile. That's actually what we wanted to talk to you about, Uncle Silas. Why don't we go inside and sit down? They went into the kitchen where Silas had been drinking his morning coffee before going out to the barn. The room was clean but worn, with linoleum floors that had lost their pattern in the high-traffic areas and countertops that dated back to when Martha had picked them out. Her presence was still everywhere. In the curtains she'd sewn, in the cookie jar shaped like a rooster that she'd loved, in the way the morning light hit the window over the sink. Raymond and Carl sat at the kitchen table without waiting to be asked. Silas remained standing, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. Uncle Silas, we need to talk seriously about your situation here, Raymond began, folding his hands on the table like a banker about to explain why a loan couldn't be approved. You're 72 years old, you're out here alone, and this place is falling apart around you. Place is fine, Silas said. I keep up with what needs keeping up with. The roof leaks, Carl interjected. The fences are sagging. You've got maybe 12 head of cattle left when you used to run 200. Face it, you can't manage this place anymore. I manage just fine. Raymond sighed, a theatrical sound meant to convey patience wearing thin. Look, we're not trying to be harsh. We're family, and we care about you. But you're not getting any younger, and this land is too much for one old man to handle. You should be in a nice place in town, somewhere with people around, where you don't have to worry about falling and nobody finding you for days. There it was. The argument they'd been building toward for months. Silas had known it was coming, had felt it in the way they'd started showing up more often, in the way they'd begun talking about him in the third person even when he was standing right there, as if he'd already become someone who couldn't make his own decisions. This is my home, Silas said quietly. I built a life here with Martha. I'm not leaving. Be reasonable, Carl said, his voice sharp now, impatience breaking through. You're sitting on 320 acres of prime land. You know what that's worth? You could sell this place, live comfortably for the rest of your days, and not have to break your back trying to keep up with work you're too old to do. Who said anything about selling? Raymond and Carl exchanged a glance, and Silas saw something pass between them, some unspoken communication that made his stomach tighten. We've been talking to some developers, Raymond said, leaning forward. There's interest in this land. Good interest. The kind of money that could set you up real nice in a retirement community. Plus, leave something substantial for the family. The family, Silas repeated. You mean you two? We're your only living relatives, Carl said, spreading his hands. Who else is there? You don't have kids of your own. When you're gone, this place comes to us anyway. We're just trying to make things easier for everyone while you're still here to enjoy the benefits. Silas looked at these two men, his sister's sons, and tried to remember them as boys. He'd taught Raymond to ride a horse when the boy was 8 years old. He'd helped pay for Carl's college textbooks when money was tight. But whatever those boys had been, these men sitting at his kitchen table were strangers, speaking a language he didn't recognize. A language where home meant real estate, where a man's life work was measured in acreage and dollar signs, where blood relation meant nothing more than inheritance rights. I want you to leave, Silas said, and don't come back unless you're invited. Raymond's face hardened. You're making a mistake, old man. This place is too much for you. Something's going to happen. You're going to fall or have a heart attack or run out of money. And then what? You'll be stuck out here with nobody to help you and no options left. That's my problem, not yours. Fine, Carl said, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. Be stubborn, but don't come crying to us when reality catches up with you. They left in their clean truck, kicking up dust as they drove away too fast down the ranch road. Silas stood on the porch and watched them go, feeling something cold settle in his chest. He'd heard threat beneath their words, seen calculation in their eyes. These weren't men who took no for an answer. These were men who wanted something and would find a way to get it. The rest of the day passed in the familiar routines that had structured his life for decades. He fed the cattle, checked the water tanks, mended a section of fence that had come loose. Rusty followed him around the paddock, limping slightly but staying close, and Silas found comfort in the animal's presence. The horse asked nothing of him except kindness and the occasional sugar cube. There was something pure in that, something uncomplicated that reminded Silas why he'd chosen this life. As evening approached and the shadows grew long across the valley, Silas stood by the fence line and looked out at his land. The red rocks glowed in the sunset, turning colors that took his breath away even after all these years. Martha used to love this time of day, used to bring her coffee out to the porch just to watch the light change. He could almost see her there now, could almost hear her voice calling him inside for supper. But the house was empty when he went inside, and the silence felt heavier than usual. He made himself a simple meal, beef and beans, cornbread left over from 2 days ago, and ate it at the kitchen table where Raymond and Carl had sat that morning. Their words lingered in the air like smoke, a contamination he couldn't quite clear away. Silas looked down at his hands, at the calluses and scars that told the story of his life. These hands had built this place. These hands had held his wife through good times and bad. These hands had earned the right to stay here until the day he died. He wouldn't let anyone take that from him. Not his nephews, not developers, not the march of time itself. This land was his, and he would hold it as long as he had breath in his body. But as he cleaned his dishes and prepared for bed, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted today, that some line had been crossed. His nephew's visit had felt different this time, more aggressive, more final. They hadn't been making suggestions. They'd been delivering an ultimatum, whether they'd said it plainly or not. He checked the doors before turning in, something he rarely bothered with. The desert night pressed against the windows, vast and dark, and somewhere out there, Silas knew, men were making plans that involved his land and his future. Men who saw him as an obstacle rather than a person, a problem to be solved rather than an uncle to be respected. Silas lay in bed and listened to the house settle around him, the familiar creaks and groans of old wood adjusting to the cooling night air. Rusty nickered softly in the barn, a sound that carried across the quiet yard. The horse was probably dreaming, twitching in his sleep the way horses do. Silas closed his eyes and tried to find sleep himself, but it came slowly, interrupted by thoughts he couldn't quite push away. He didn't know then that he had 3 weeks left before his nephews would make their move. Didn't know that the morning routines he took for granted, the barn chores, the coffee on the porch, the sunset over the red rocks, were numbered and finite. Didn't know that everything he'd built, everything he loved, was about to be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. But some part of him sensed it, the way animals sense storms before they arrive. Some part of him knew that the men who'd sat at his kitchen table weren't done with him, that they'd return with something more than words next time. He just didn't know how far they'd go, didn't know what they were capable of, didn't know that the desert he'd lived beside for 47 years was about to become either his grave or his salvation, depending on how the next few days unfolded. The night deepened, and Silas finally drifted into uneasy sleep, his worn leather work gloves hanging on the bedpost where they always hung, the smell of honest labor still clinging to them, a reminder of the man he'd always been and refused to stop being, no matter what came next. 3 weeks passed in deceptive calm. Silas fell back into his routines, and if he thought about his nephews at all, it was only in passing, a vague unease that he pushed to the back of his mind. He had work to do, animals to tend, a life to live. He couldn't spend his days worrying about what Raymond and Carl might be planning. The morning it happened started like any other. Silas woke before dawn, made his coffee, and headed out to the barn to check on Rusty. The horse greeted him with a soft nicker, and Silas went through the familiar motions of feeding and watering, his hands moving with the muscle memory of thousands of identical mornings. He didn't hear the truck approach until it was already in the yard. 2 trucks this time, Raymond's black pickup and another one Silas didn't recognize, a beat-up Ford that had seen better days. 4 men climbed out, and Silas's stomach dropped when he saw that Raymond and Carl had brought help. The other 2 were rough-looking characters, the kind of men who got hired for cash and didn't ask questions. "Morning, Uncle Silas," Raymond called out, walking toward the barn with purpose in his stride. "Time for that talk we mentioned. I thought I made myself clear last time," Silas said, moving to stand in the barn doorway, blocking their path. "You're not welcome here." "Well, that's unfortunate," Carl said, coming up beside his brother, "because we're not leaving until this gets settled. We've got papers drawn up, all nice and legal. You sign over power of attorney to us. We'll make sure you're taken care of." Everyone wins. I'm not signing anything. Raymond sighed, and it wasn't the theatrical sigh from before. This one was colder, more final. We were hoping you'd be reasonable. We really were. But you've left us no choice. The two hired men moved forward then, flanking Silas on either side. He tried to push past them, but he was one old man against four younger ones, and the math wasn't in his favor. They grabbed his arms, not rough enough to leave marks, but firm enough to make it clear he wasn't going anywhere they didn't want him to go. "What are you doing?" Silas demanded, his voice rising. "You can't just what?" Carl interrupted. "Help our elderly uncle who's clearly not thinking straight, who's been out here alone too long and isn't making good decisions anymore. That's how everyone in town will see it, old man. We're the concerned family members trying to help." They marched him toward the house, and Silas fought against their grip, anger and fear surging through him in equal measure. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not on his own land. But it was happening, and his struggles meant nothing against their combined strength. Inside the house, they sat him down at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd made their offer 3 weeks ago. Raymond laid out papers, official-looking documents with places marked for signatures, power of attorney, transfer of assets, language that essentially signed away everything Silas owned. "Sign them," Raymond said, placing a pen in front of him. "Go to hell." Carl leaned in close, his breath hot against Silas's ear. "Here's how this is going to go. You can sign these papers and we'll set you up nice in a facility in town. Clean room, 3 meals a day, people to look after you, or you can keep being difficult and things get a lot harder for you. Your choice. You're threatening me? Your own family. We're giving you options," Raymond corrected. "And honestly, you should take the easy one, because if you don't—" He paused, glancing at his brother, then continued. "Well, accidents happen out here all the time. Old man wandering off in the heat, getting confused, getting lost, desserts not forgiving to someone your age." The words hit Silas like cold water. They were serious. They were actually threatening to, what? Leave him out there. Let him die of exposure if he didn't cooperate. He looked at their faces and saw no mercy, no family resemblance to the boys he'd once known. Just greed and impatience and a willingness to do whatever it took to get what they wanted. "I won't sign," Silas said, his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. "You'll have to kill me first." Raymond and Carl exchanged another look, and Silas saw the decision made in that silent communication. His refusal had pushed them past some invisible line, and now they were committed to a course of action they'd probably hoped to avoid. "All right then," Raymond said softly. "Have it your way." They dragged him back outside, and Silas fought every step, shouting for help even though he knew no one would hear. The nearest neighbor was 6 miles away, and the wind was picking up, carrying his voice away into the vast emptiness of the desert. One of the hired men went to the barn and emerged leading Rusty, the horse limping along on his bad leg, confused and nervous. "What are you doing?" Silas demanded. "Leave the horse alone. You wanted to stay with your precious Rusty," Carl said, opening the gate to the paddock. "So that's what you'll do. You and that lame animal can keep each other company out in the Devil's Anvil." The Devil's Anvil. The name sent ice through Silas's veins. It was a stretch of desert about 5 miles east of the ranch, barren, waterless, and notorious for its killing heat. People didn't go there unless they had no choice, and they certainly didn't go there without water and supplies. And now, Silas looked at the sky. There was weather coming in. He could see the dark clouds building on the horizon, could smell the particular tang in the air that meant a sandstorm was brewing. "You can't do this," Silas said, but his voice had lost its strength. He could see in their eyes that they could, that they would, that they already had. They loaded him onto Rusty's back, the horse shifting nervously beneath him. Silas tried to dismount, but the hired men held him in place while Raymond climbed into his truck. They drove ahead, forcing Rusty to follow, leading them away from the ranch and out toward the open desert. The horse limped along, struggling with the extra weight and the uneven ground, and Silas's heart broke for the animal as much as for himself. They drove for nearly an hour, heading deep into the Devil's Anvil, until the ranch was far behind them, and there was nothing around but sand and rocks and scrub brush that clung to life in the hostile soil. The wind had picked up considerably now, and Silas could taste dust on his tongue. The storm was coming, and it was going to be bad. Finally, Raymond stopped the truck. They were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by rolling dunes and rock formations that all looked the same. Silas knew he could walk, For days out here and not find his way back. He knew that's exactly what his nephews were counting on. "This is where you get off, Uncle Silas," Raymond said, and there was something in his voice, not quite regret, but maybe its distant cousin. "You can try to make it back if you want. Maybe you'll even survive the storm, but I doubt it. And when they find you in a few days, everyone will just think you wandered off." Sad story about an old man who couldn't accept his limitations. They pulled him off Rusty's back and left him standing there, one hand on the horse's neck for support. Silas wanted to say something, wanted to find words that would make them understand what they were doing, but his throat was too tight and his mind too stunned. This was family. This was blood, and they were leaving him here to die. "You'll never get away with this," Silas finally managed. Carl laughed, a harsh sound that the wind caught and scattered. "Get away with what? We tried to help our uncle, but he was stubborn. He wandered off during a storm. These things happen. No one's going to question it." They climbed back into their trucks and drove away, leaving a rooster tail of dust in their wake. Silas stood and watched them go, one hand still on Rusty's neck, feeling the horse's warmth and the steady rhythm of his breathing. The storm clouds were moving in fast now, turning the sky an ugly yellow-brown color that promised violence. Silas looked down at Rusty's leg, at the way the horse favored it, and felt despair wash over him. They'd left him here with a lame horse, no water, no supplies, and a sandstorm bearing down on them. His nephews had calculated everything perfectly. By the time anyone came looking, it would be too late. The first gusts of the storm hit, and sand peppered Silas's face. Rusty whinnied nervously, pressing against him. The horse's fear cut through Silas's shock, bringing him back to himself. He couldn't just stand here and give up. He had to try, for himself, for the life he'd built, and for this faithful animal who'd been dragged into danger because of him. "All right, old friend," Silas said, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "Let's find some shelter. We're not done yet." He led Rusty forward into the teeth of the approaching storm, searching for anything. A rock formation, a depression in the sand, anything that might offer protection from what was coming. The wind howled around them, and visibility dropped as the storm rolled in like a living thing, hungry and indifferent to the two creatures struggling beneath its fury. The sandstorm hit with a fury that took Silas's breath away. One moment he could see 20 yards ahead, and the next the world disappeared behind a wall of churning sand and dust. The wind screamed across the desert, carrying with it particles of rock and debris that stung any exposed skin like angry hornets. Silas pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth, trying to filter the air, but sand found its way into everything. His eyes, his ears, the creases of his clothing. Rusty pressed against him, the horse's body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The animal's breath came in harsh gasps, and Silas could feel the heat radiating from the horse's flanks. The limp had gotten worse during their forced march out here, and Silas knew Rusty was in pain. The thought of the horse suffering because of his nephew's greed filled him with a rage so intense it momentarily pushed aside his fear. But rage wouldn't save them. They needed shelter, and they needed it now. Silas squinted into the storm, one hand on Rusty's halter, the other raised to shield his face. The visibility was down to almost nothing now. He could barely see his own boots, let alone any features of the landscape that might offer protection. But he kept moving forward, trusting some instinct he didn't fully understand, some sense that had been honed by nearly 5 decades of living in this country. The ground beneath their feet began to change. Silas felt it before he saw it. The sand giving way to harder packed earth, then to rock. They were approaching one of the Devil's Anvil's many formations, ancient stone shaped by wind and time into strange sculptures that dotted the desert. In better weather, these formations were landmarks. In a sandstorm, they could be either salvation or death traps, depending on how the wind moved around them. Silas pulled Rusty close and felt his way forward, hands outstretched, moving by touch rather than sight. His fingers found rock, rough and sun-heated even in the storm. He followed the stone face, searching for an indentation, a cave, anything that would get them out of the direct blast of the wind. And then, as if in answer to a prayer he hadn't spoken aloud, his hand found empty space, a gap in the rock, large enough for... Silas felt around the opening, judging its size. Large enough for a man and a horse if they didn't mind being close. "Come on, boy." Silas urged, tugging gently on Rusty's halter. The horse balked at first, nervous about entering the dark space, but another gust of wind made the decision for him. He lurched forward and Silas guided him into the shelter. It wasn't much, a shallow overhang created by the way the rock had eroded, maybe 10 feet deep and barely tall enough for Rusty to stand without lowering his head. But it was out of the direct wind, and that made all the difference. The sound of the storm changed from a screaming assault to a dull roar. Sand still swirled in through the opening, but nothing like the blinding curtain outside. Silas sank down against the back wall, his legs suddenly too weak to hold him. Rusty stood beside him, flanks heaving, head lowered. The horse's bad leg was clearly paining him now. He held it at an angle, taking most of his weight on the other 3 legs. Silas reached up and ran his hand down the injured limb, feeling the heat of inflammation, the slight swelling around the joint. "I'm sorry, old friend," Silas whispered. "This is all my fault? You shouldn't be out here." Rusty lowered his head further and rested his muzzle against Silas's shoulder, a gesture of trust that made the old rancher's throat tighten. This animal had given him everything: years of loyal service, companionship through his loneliest days, a living connection to Martha that he couldn't bear to let go. And now Rusty was suffering because Silas hadn't been smart enough, hadn't been careful enough to see what his nephews were planning. The storm raged outside their shelter, and Silas knew they were in serious trouble. He had no water, no food, no supplies of any kind. Even if the storm passed quickly, and desert storms rarely did, they would still be stranded miles from anywhere, with a horse who could barely walk and no clear way to navigate back to civilization. The Devil's Anvil was a maze of dunes and rock formations that all looked the same. Men had died out here, experienced men who'd known what they were doing, and Silas was 72 years old with a lame horse and no provisions. But he was still alive. That had to count for something. As the initial shock of their situation began to wear off, Silas's mind started working again, sorting through possibilities the way he'd sorted through problems his entire life. First priority was surviving the storm. Second was finding water. Third was figuring out a way back to the ranch, or at least to somewhere with people who could help. He felt around in his pockets, taking inventory of what he had. His leather work gloves, which he'd been wearing when his nephews grabbed him. A pocket knife, worn but sharp. A book of matches, thank God, that he kept for lighting the occasional cigar. 17 cents in change, and that was it. No compass, no map, no way to call for help. His nephews had been thorough. The light was fading as the storm continued to block out the sun. Silas couldn't tell if it was actually evening approaching or just the thickness of the sand in the air, but either way, darkness was coming, and with darkness in the desert came cold, temperatures that could drop 40 degrees from their daytime highs. Silas's shirt was thin, meant for summer heat, not for the chill of a desert night. And then there was the other problem, the one he'd been trying not to think about. Coyotes. The Devil's Anvil had always had a healthy coyote population. They were drawn by the jackrabbits and ground squirrels that made their homes among the rocks, and they were opportunistic hunters who wouldn't pass up easier prey if it presented itself. A lame horse and an old man would look like easy prey to a pack of hungry coyotes, especially at night when the predators were most active. Silas looked at Rusty, at the way the horse's eyes were half closed with exhaustion, and made a decision. They would survive this night. He didn't know how yet, but he would find a way. He hadn't lived 72 years, hadn't built a life from nothing, hadn't survived losing Martha just to give up and die in the desert because his nephews were too greedy to wait for nature to take its course. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse, the wind shifting directions, sand piling up in drifts against the rocks. Silas closed his eyes and let himself rest, conserving his strength for whatever came next. Beside him, Rusty's breathing gradually slowed and deepened as the horse dozed, standing up the way horses do. They had shelter for now. They had each other. And somewhere in Silas's chest, beneath the fear and the anger and the exhaustion, a small flame of defiance still burned. His nephews thought they'd killed him. They'd driven away congratulating themselves on a job well done, already mentally spending the money they'd make from selling his land. But Silas Vance wasn't dead yet, and if he survived this, when he survived this, Raymond and Carl were going to learn that there were consequences for what they'd done. You didn't betray family. You didn't leave a man to die in the desert, and you sure as hell didn't mess with someone who'd spent his entire life learning how to survive in this unforgiving country. The storm howled outside, sand hissing against stone, and Silas opened his eyes to watch the world disappear behind curtains of dust and fury. Somewhere out there was his ranch, his home, the life he'd built. He would get back to it. He had to believe that, had to hold on to that certainty like a lifeline, because the alternative, giving up, accepting this as his end, was something Silas Vance simply could not do. Night came to the desert the way it always did. Suddenly and completely. One moment there was the murky brown light of the storm-darkened day, and the next there was blackness so total that Silas couldn't see his hand in front of his face. The storm had finally begun to ease, the wind dropping from a scream to a moan, but the darkness it left behind was absolute. Silas sat with his back against the rock wall, Rusty standing close beside him, and listened to the sounds of the desert night. The storm's diminishing roar, the occasional skitter of sand against stone, his own breathing and the horses, and then, carrying across the cooling air, a sound that made his blood run cold, the high-pitched yip and howl of coyotes. They were distant still, maybe a mile or more away, but sound carried far in the desert air, and Silas knew the animals were on the move, hunting, searching for food, and sooner or later they would catch the scent of horse and man sheltering among the rocks. Rusty heard them too. The horse's head came up, ears pricked forward, body tensing. A soft nicker escaped him, nervous and questioning. Silas reached up and laid a calming hand on the horse's neck. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." It was a promise that felt hollow, even as he spoke it. What could one unarmed old man do against a pack of hungry coyotes? His pocket knife would be useless against multiple attackers. His hands, strong as they still were, couldn't hold off teeth and claws in the dark. But then Silas's fingers touched the book of matches in his pocket, and an idea began to form. Fire. Coyotes feared fire. Every animal did, really. It was primal, instinctive, bred into them over millennia of evolution. If he could make a fire, keep it burning through the night, it might be enough to keep the pack at bay. The problem was fuel. This shallow overhang didn't offer much in the way of burnable material. Silas felt around in the darkness, his hands searching the ground, and found only sand and rock. But wait, he'd seen scrub brush earlier, before the storm hit. Dead, dry brush that grew in twisted clumps wherever it could find purchase in the harsh soil. Some of it had to be nearby. Silas waited until the wind dropped further, until he could see the faintest outline of the opening to their shelter against the slightly less dark sky beyond. Then he patted Rusty's neck and said, "Stay here. I'll be right back." He crawled toward the opening, moving slowly, careful not to spook the horse. The moment he left the shelter, the residual wind hit him, nowhere near as strong as before, but still carrying sand that stung his face. He couldn't go far. He'd never find his way back in the darkness. So he stayed close to the rock face, moving by touch, searching for anything that would burn. His hands found it after several minutes of careful exploration. A dead bush, its branches dry and brittle, growing in a crack between two boulders. Silas snapped off as many branches as he could carry, then felt his way back to the shelter. Inside, he arranged the wood carefully, making a small pile near the opening where smoke could escape but the wind wouldn't extinguish the flames. The first match flared bright in the darkness, momentarily blinding him. He touched it to the driest twig, watched it catch, then carefully added more fuel. The small fire grew, pushing back the darkness, and Silas felt something in his chest unclench slightly. Not safety, they were far from safe, but a weapon against the night at least. The coyote howls came again, closer now. Silas counted voices in his head, at least 4, maybe 5. A decent-sized pack. They would be organized, efficient hunters who could bring down prey much larger than themselves when working together. In the firelight, Silas could see Rusty's eyes rolling white with fear, could see the way the horse trembled. "I know," Silas said softly. "I'm scared too, but we're going to be all right." He fed another branch to the fire, then crawled back out into the darkness. He needed more wood, enough to last through the night. This time he ranged a bit farther, always keeping one hand on the rock face to guide him back, gathering every piece of dry brush he could. Find 2 trips, 3. Each time he returned with his arms full, adding to the pile inside the shelter. By the 4th trip, he heard them. Not howling now, but closer sounds. The soft pad of feet on sand, the panting of animals on the move. They'd found the scent. They were coming. Silas hurried back to the shelter with his last load of branches. In the firelight, he could see movement outside, shadows that circled just beyond the reach of the flames. Yellow eyes reflected the fire, appearing and disappearing as the coyotes moved, evaluating, calculating. They were testing, Silas realized. Seeing how brave this firekeeper was, how well defended this shelter might be. Coyotes were smart. They wouldn't risk injury if there was easier prey elsewhere. But if they sensed weakness, if they thought they could get to the horse, one of them darted forward, quick as thought, teeth snapping at empty air just at the edge of the firelight. Rusty screamed, a high, terrified sound, and lunged backward, nearly falling in the confined space. His bad leg buckled, and he went down to his knees before scrambling back up, all his weight on his 3 good legs. "Hey!" Silas shouted, grabbing a burning branch from the fire and thrusting it forward. The coyote yelped and retreated, but not far. The others moved in closer, emboldened by their companion's near success. Silas realized with sinking certainty that they weren't going to give up. They could smell blood now. Rusty had scraped his knee in his fall, nothing serious, but enough to fill the air with the scent of prey. They could smell fear. They knew the horse was injured, vulnerable, and they had all night to wait for an opening. So Silas planted himself at the entrance to the shelter, the burning branch in one hand, his pocket knife in the other. Behind him, Rusty stood on trembling legs, sides heaving. The fire burned between them and the circling pack, but Silas knew the wood wouldn't last forever. Already his pile was half gone. He'd have to make another run for fuel soon, and when he did, the largest coyote, a male who seemed to be the pack leader, stepped into the firelight. He was big for his kind, maybe 50 pounds of muscle and teeth, with a scarred muzzle that spoke of previous fights. He stared at Silas with eyes that held a cold, calculating intelligence, assessing the old man the way Silas had assessed countless opponents over his long life. "You're not getting him," Silas said, his voice steady despite the fear racing through his veins. "You hear me? You're not getting my horse." The coyote's lip curled, revealing teeth that gleamed in the firelight. Then he threw back his head and howled, a sound that brought answering calls from his packmates. They were gathering, coordinating, preparing for a concerted rush. Silas tightened his grip on the burning branch and prepared to fight for both their lives. 72 years old, 1 pocket knife, 1 makeshift torch, standing between a pack of predators and a lame horse who trusted him. The situation was impossible. The odds were ridiculous. Any sensible person would give up, would save himself and leave the horse to its fate. But Silas had never been particularly sensible, and giving up wasn't in his nature. He'd survived ranch work, survived loss, survived 7 decades of life's challenges. He'd survived his nephew's betrayal and a killer sandstorm. He'd be damned if he'd let some coyotes write the ending to his story. "Come on, then," Silas called to the circling pack, raising his torch higher. "Let's see what you've got." The pack leader tensed, muscles bunching for the attack, and Silas braced himself for the longest night of his life. The attack came from 3 directions at once. The pack leader charged straight ahead while 2 others flanked from the sides, a coordinated assault that spoke of experience and hunger. Silas swung his torch in a wide arc, catching the leader across the muzzle. The animal yelped and fell back, but one of the flanking coyotes got through, teeth snapping at Rusty's haunches. The horse kicked out instinctively, his hoof connecting with the coyote's ribs and sending it tumbling backward with a pained cry. Silas lunged forward with his knife, more to scare than to strike, and the remaining attacker retreated, but they'd learned something valuable in that first rush. The old man could only defend one direction at a time. The horse was panicked and unpredictable, but confined to the small space. All they had to do was keep pressing, keep testing, until exhaustion or fear created an opening. The night settled into a brutal rhythm. The coyotes would circle, feint, withdraw, then attack again from a different angle. Silas kept the torch moving, kept his body between the predators and Rusty, but he could feel his strength ebbing with each defense. His arms ached from swinging the burning branch. His legs trembled from standing. The adrenaline that had fueled him at first was giving way to simple, grinding fatigue. Rusty stood pressed against the back wall, eyes rolling white, foam flecking his muzzle. The horse's bad leg was barely touching the ground now, and Silas knew the animal was in agony. But Rusty stayed on his feet, stayed ready to kick if anything got past Silas's defense. There was something profound in that, the horse's determination to fight despite his pain, his trust that Silas would protect him, his refusal to give up even when giving up would have been easier. "That's it, boy," Silas murmured during a lull in the attacks. "That's it. Just a few more hours till dawn. We can make it." But could they? Silas looked at his dwindling pile of firewood and knew the answer was far from certain. He had maybe an hour of fuel left, 2 at most if he rationed carefully. After that, it would be just him and his knife against 5 hungry predators. The math wasn't encouraging. He thought about Martha then, about the way she used to look at him when he'd come in from a hard day's work, that mixture of exasperation and affection that had defined their marriage. She'd have something to say about this situation, probably something along the lines of, "Silas Vance, you stubborn old fool, why didn't you just let them take you to town?" But she'd also understand why he couldn't. Why this ranch, this life, this independence meant more to him than safety or comfort. Martha had chosen this life too, had worked beside him for 31 years without complaint, had loved the land as much as he did. She'd understand that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for if it came to that. He wondered what she'd make of Raymond and Carl. Her sister's boys, technically her nephews too, though Martha had never been particularly close to her sister. They'd visited once or twice when Martha was alive, always with their hands out, always angling for something. Martha had seen through them even then, had warned Silas to be careful around them. He should have listened better. The pack leader rushed again, this time from Silas's blind side. Teeth grazed his calf, tearing through denim but not quite reaching skin. Silas spun and brought the torch down hard, forcing the animal back. But the coyote had drawn blood, not his, but enough to tell him the old man was slowing down. The attacks would increase now. They sensed weakness. Silas's hands shook as he added another branch to the fire. The flames had died down to coals, and he couldn't afford to let them go out completely. But every branch he burned was one less in his reserve. The choice was immediate warmth and light or prolonged defense. He chose warmth, building the fire back up, hoping the increased light would keep the pack at bay a little longer. Behind him, Rusty whinnied softly, a sound of exhaustion and pain. Silas turned and saw the horse had lain down, finally unable to stand any longer on his injured leg. Rusty's flanks heaved, breath coming in gasps, and his eyes held a look that Silas recognized. The look of an animal who had reached the end of his endurance. "No," Silas said, moving to the horse's side, momentarily forgetting the circling predators. "No, don't you give up on me. Come on, old friend. We're so close." He knelt beside Rusty and ran his hand along the horse's neck, feeling the sweat-soaked coat, the rapid pulse beneath the skin. This animal had carried Martha through countless mornings, had been her favorite, her companion, the one she'd chosen when they still had the money to be choosy about such things. Rusty wasn't just a horse. He was the last living piece of her, the last connection to those years when Silas hadn't been alone. "I'm sorry," Silas whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I got you into this." Rusty turned his head and rested his muzzle against Silas's chest, the gesture so full of trust and affection that it nearly broke him. Here in the darkness, surrounded by predators, facing death in the cold desert night, this horse was offering comfort, asking for nothing except Silas's presence, forgiving everything. Silas felt tears on his cheeks and didn't bother wiping them away. 72 years of living had taught him that some moments deserved tears. That strength wasn't about never breaking down, but about getting back up after you did. He'd cried when Martha died. Cried until he thought he'd run dry, and then somehow kept living. He'd cry now if he wanted to, here in the darkness where no one could see him except a tired horse and a pack of coyotes who didn't care about human emotions. But the tears cleared something in his mind, burned away the fear and exhaustion, and left behind a core of pure, unyielding determination. He'd made Rusty a promise back at the ranch when this whole nightmare started. He'd promised this horse would never be abandoned, would never be left behind, would be cared for as long as Silas had breath in his body. That promise still held. Even here, even now, Silas stood back up, his body protesting every movement, and returned to his post at the entrance. The coyotes were still there, still circling, yellow eyes reflecting the firelight. But something had changed in Silas, some shift that the animals must have sensed because they held back, wary now, where they'd been confident before. "You want him?" Silas called out to the pack, his voice hoarse but steady. "You'll have to go through me, and I promise you, that won't be as easy as you think." He picked up his torch again, held it high, and waited for the next attack. Dawn was still hours away. The fire wouldn't last. The odds were impossible, but Silas Vance had made a promise to a horse named Rusty, and to a woman who'd been gone 5 years, but whose memory still guided his every decision. He would keep that promise, or die trying. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Each minute felt like 10, each successful defense of their shelter followed by another attack, another test of Silas's failing strength. The coyotes had settled into a war of attrition, understanding that time was on their side. They took turns rushing forward. One would feint from the left while another darted in from the right. Then they'd retreat, rest, and let others try while the first pair recovered their breath. Silas had no such luxury. He couldn't rest, couldn't drop his guard for even a moment. His torch arm felt like lead, muscles screaming with each swing. His vision had started to blur at the edges, exhaustion and dehydration taking their toll. How long had it been since he'd had water? Since morning, back at the ranch. A lifetime ago. The fire had burned down to embers again, and Silas's woodpile was nearly gone. 3 branches left, maybe 4. Enough for another 30 minutes if he was careful. After that, he pushed the thought away. He'd deal with after that when it came. One of the smaller coyotes, emboldened by Silas's visible exhaustion, made a break for it. The animal shot past Silas's left side, too quick for the torch, heading straight for where Rusty lay. Silas dropped the burning branch and threw himself after the coyote, tackling it mid-leap. They hit the ground together, Silas on top, his hands finding the animal's scruff. The coyote twisted, snapping, teeth catching the meat of Silas's forearm. Pain blazed up his arm, but he held on, using his weight to pin the animal. His free hand found his pocket knife, still clutched in his grip, and he brought it down hard. The coyote yelped and went limp. Silas rolled off it, breathing hard, clutching his bleeding arm. The other coyotes had gone silent, watching. Their packmate lay still, a dark pool spreading beneath it. Silas had killed before, animals for food, injured livestock that needed putting down, but never in combat, never in self-defense. His hands shook as he retrieved his torch and returned to his post. The pack circled tighter now, their earlier caution replaced with anger. They'd lost one of their own, but the kill had also shown them something. This old man was still dangerous, still capable of doing damage. The calculus had changed. For perhaps 20 minutes they held back, regrouping, reassessing. Silas used the respite to bind his arm with a strip torn from his shirt, trying to staunch the bleeding. The bite wasn't deep, but it hurt like fire, and he could feel blood soaking through the makeshift bandage. Another problem to deal with if he survived the night. When he survived the night. Rusty hadn't moved from where he lay, but the horse's eyes were open, watching. Silas could see the animal's chest rising and falling, could hear the labored breathing. The horse was fading, giving up. Silas crawled over to him, laying a hand on Rusty's neck. "Just a few more hours," he whispered. "Dawn's coming. I can feel it." But he couldn't, not really. The darkness seemed absolute, eternal, as if the sun had forgotten about this corner of the desert. The cold had deepened too, that bone-chilling desert cold that came in the hours before dawn. Silas's teeth chattered, and he pulled himself closer to Rusty, sharing what little warmth their bodies still held. He thought about his life, not in the dramatic, life flashing before your eyes way, but in quiet, measured reflection. 72 years. Some good, some hard, most somewhere in between. He'd been born in a different era, before computers and internet, before the world had gotten so fast and complicated. He'd lived through wars and recessions, through personal triumphs and devastating losses. He'd built something with his hands and his back, had created a life that meant something, at least to him. And now it might all end here, in a shallow cave in the Devil's Anvil, fighting off coyotes while his nephews slept peacefully in town, counting his money before they'd even legally gotten their hands on it. The injustice of it burned in Silas's gut, not for himself. He'd made peace with his own mortality years ago. But for Rusty, the horse deserved better, deserved to live out his days in a sunny paddock, eating sweet hay, dozing in the afternoon warmth. Not this, not bleeding and terrified in the dark while predators circled. "I'm going to get you home," Silas promised, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how, but I swear to you I'm going to get you home." The pack leader moved forward again, testing. Silas raised his torch, now little more than a charred stick with a faint glow at one end. And the animal stopped, but it didn't retreat. It stood there, 10 feet away, staring at Silas with those calculating yellow eyes, weighing options, measuring the old man's remaining strength. Silas stared back, refusing to blink, refusing to show weakness. This was what it came down to in the end. Pure will, pure stubborn refusal to quit. He'd spent his whole life not quitting. Not when the bank threatened foreclosure in '82, not when Martha got sick, not when the droughts came or the cattle died or the loneliness nearly crushed him. He'd endured because that's what you did. You endured. The pack leader took another step forward, then another. Silas's torch was almost out now, just a faint red glow. His last 3 branches were behind him, too far to reach without turning his back on the advancing coyote. His knife was ready, but he knew one knife against a determined predator wouldn't be enough. Not anymore. He was too tired, too hurt, too old. And then, just when Silas thought this was it, this was the final moment, he saw something on the horizon, the faintest lightening of the sky, so subtle he almost missed it. Not full dawn, that was still an hour or more away, but the first hint of it, the promise that the sun hadn't forgotten after all. The pack leader saw it too. Silas watched the animal's ears swivel, catching sounds Silas's old ears couldn't hear. The desert was waking up. Daytime hunters would soon be stirring. The coyote's window of opportunity was closing. For another endless minute, the standoff continued. Silas and the coyote, each refusing to back down. Then, with a final shake of his head, the pack leader turned and trotted away. The others followed, silent as ghosts, melting into the pre-dawn darkness. They'd lost one of their own, expended energy on a kill that hadn't materialized, and now faced a day of hunting with nothing to show for it. But they were alive. And in the desert, that was what mattered. Silas watched them go, not daring to believe it was really over. Only when the last tail disappeared behind a dune did he let himself collapse, the torch falling from his nerveless fingers. He lay on the cold sand, every muscle in his body screaming, his wounded arm throbbing, his throat raw with thirst. But he was alive. Rusty was alive. They'd made it through the night. The sky continued to lighten, turning from black to deep purple to a soft gray. Silas pulled himself up and crawled to Rusty's side. The horse's eyes were open, watching the same sky, seeing the same promise of dawn. "We did it, old friend," Silas whispered. "We actually did it." But relief was tempered by reality. They'd survived the night, but their problems were far from over. No water, no food, miles from help. A lame horse who couldn't walk far, and Silas himself was in no condition to make the journey back alone. As the first rays of sun crested the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Silas forced himself to think practically. They needed to move, needed to find water, needed to figure out a way back to civilization. But first, just for a moment, he let himself rest. Let himself feel the warmth of the rising sun on his face. Let himself be grateful for one more morning, one more day of life. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the brutal heat that made the Devil's Anvil infamous. Silas sat with his back against the rock wall, conserving what little energy he had left. His wounded arm throbbed steadily, and his throat felt like sandpaper. Dehydration was setting in. He could tell by the headache building behind his eyes, the way his thoughts seemed to move through mud. Rusty had finally managed to stand again, though he kept most of his weight off his bad leg. The horse stood at the entrance to their shelter, head lowered, looking out at the transformed landscape. The storm had reshaped the desert, moving dunes, exposing bedrock, creating a terrain that looked alien, even to Silas's experienced eyes. "We need to move," Silas said aloud, as much to motivate himself as to communicate with the horse. "Can't stay here. Need water." But where? The nearest water source Silas knew of was a seep spring about 3 miles north, if he could even find it in this rearranged landscape. 3 miles might as well be 30 with Rusty's leg in his own condition. Still, staying here meant dying slowly of thirst. At least moving gave them a chance. Silas stood, using the rock wall for support, and took a step toward the opening, then stopped. Something outside had caught his eye, something that didn't belong. The storm had scoured away a massive section of the sand dune they'd sheltered behind. Where yesterday there had been 15 feet of sand sloping away from their position, now there was bare rock and compacted soil, and something else. Something metallic, reflecting the morning sun in a way that natural stone didn't. Silas squinted against the brightness, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A flat surface, dark iron or steel, protruding from the exposed ground at an angle. It was maybe 20 feet away, partially buried but clearly man-made. His first thought was some kind of modern debris, an old water tank or piece of equipment left behind by prospectors. But as he moved closer, limping on legs that barely wanted to hold him, Silas realized this was older than anything modern. Much older. The metal was heavily oxidized, pitted with age, but he could make out rivets along what appeared to be a seam. And there, as his heart began to beat faster, he could see painted letters, faded almost to nothing but still barely legible. Wells Fargo & Co. A stagecoach. The storm had uncovered a buried stagecoach. Silas's mind raced, sorting through decades of local history and ranch country legends. There were stories. Old stories, the kind told in bars and around campfires, about a Wells Fargo coach that had disappeared during a massive sandstorm back in the 1870s. The coach had been carrying a payroll shipment, gold bars meant for the mining camps in the Northern Territories. Tens of thousands of dollars worth, maybe more. The coach, its driver, guards and cargo had simply vanished, swallowed by the desert. Search parties had looked for weeks and found nothing. Most people assumed it was just a story, the way most desert legends were just stories. Entertaining, but ultimately fictional. But Silas knew that every legend started with some kernel of truth. He'd lived in this country long enough to know that the desert kept its secrets until it was ready to give them up. He looked back at the exposed metal, his practical rancher's mind already working through the implications. If this really was the lost Wells Fargo coach, if the cargo was still inside after all these years. No, that was crazy thinking. The gold would have been looted long ago, or it had never existed in the first place, or it had been moved, or any of a dozen other reasonable explanations. But Silas hadn't survived 72 years by ignoring possibilities, no matter how unlikely. He moved closer to the buried coach. Pain and exhaustion momentarily forgotten. The metal he could see appeared to be the roof, angled at about 45 degrees and half buried in compressed soil. The storm had revealed it, but getting inside would require digging. Silas looked at his hands, thought about his condition, and almost laughed at the absurdity. Here he was, dying of thirst in the desert, considering whether to spend precious energy digging up a probably empty stagecoach on the off chance it might contain a legendary fortune. Martha would have called him 10 kinds of fool. But then again, what else was he going to do? Try to walk 3 miles to a spring he might not be able to find? Sit in the shelter and wait for death? At least investigating the coach gave him a purpose, a reason to keep moving. Using his pocket knife and his bare hands, Silas began to dig. The soil around the coach's roof had been compressed by decades of weight, baked hard by the sun, but the storm had loosened it somewhat. He scooped away dirt and sand, working methodically despite his exhaustion, driven by something he couldn't quite name. Curiosity? Hope? Or maybe just the stubborn need to know. Rusty watched from the shelter, occasionally nickering as if questioning his human's sanity. Silas couldn't blame him. This probably looked crazy. Hell, it was crazy. But after 20 minutes of digging, Silas's fingers found something. Not more metal, but wood. The coach's frame, surprisingly well preserved under the protective layer of compacted soil. He cleared more area, working faster now, and found what he was looking for. The door, or where the door should be. The wood had rotted away, leaving only the metal frame and hinges. Silas peered through the opening into darkness. The coach's interior was below ground level, still buried, protected from the elements all these years. He couldn't see much, but he could make out shapes. Cargo of some kind, remarkably intact given the decades that had passed. His heart hammered in his chest. This was real. The coach was real, and if the stories were even partially true, he squeezed through the opening, dropping down into the coach's interior. It smelled of old leather and ancient dust, and it was cooler here, out of the direct sun. Silas's eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness. There were wooden crates, 3 of them, stacked against what had been the coach's back wall. The wood was dark with age, but solid, and they were heavy. He could tell just by looking at them, by the way they sat immovable despite the coach's angle. With shaking hands, Silas used his knife to pry at one of the crates. The wood was brittle, and after a few moments of work, one side came away with a splintering crack. Inside, packed in rotting cloth, were bars, metal bars, dull gold in color, each about the size of a brick, stamped with marks that Silas's educated guess said were assayer's marks from the 1870s. Gold. It was actually gold. Silas pulled one bar out, feeling its weight. Had to be 20 pounds at least, and stared at it in disbelief. Then he looked at the other crates, doing rough math in his head. If each crate held what this one held, and if gold was worth, he'd seen something in the news about gold prices hitting record highs. The numbers were staggering, life-changing, world-changing. This wasn't just money. This was fortune, real fortune, the kind that made men rich beyond their wildest dreams. And it was his, or it could be his, if he could figure out how to claim it legally. Finder's rights had to count for something, and he'd found it on public land. Technically, the Devil's Anvil wasn't part of any ranch, including his own. It was federal land that no one had bothered with because it was worthless desert. Silas climbed back out of the coach, the gold bar still in his hands, and looked out at the desert with new eyes. The situation had just changed completely. He was no longer a dying old man abandoned by his greedy nephews. He was a man sitting on a fortune that would make him one of the richest people in the state. Raymond and Carl thought they'd killed him, thought they'd inherit his land and live comfortable lives on the proceeds. They had no idea that the uncle they'd left to die had just stumbled onto something worth 100 times more than his ranch could ever bring. Silas thought about his nephews, sleeping peacefully in town, and felt a smile spread across his cracked lips despite the pain, despite the thirst, despite everything. Poetic justice didn't begin to cover this. This was biblical. This was karma on a scale that made his head spin. But first, and this brought him back to reality, he needed to survive. The gold didn't mean anything if he died out here. He needed water, needed to get Rusty to safety, needed to make it back to civilization with proof of what he'd found. Silas looked at the gold bar in his hands, then back at Rusty, who was watching him with patient, exhausted eyes. The horse had saved his life last night just by being there, by giving him something worth protecting. Now Silas needed to save them both. He set the gold bar down carefully. He'd come back for it, all of it, but right now survival took priority and made his way back to Rusty. The horse let Silas lean against him, and together they stood there in the morning sun, an old man and an old horse, both battered and exhausted, but somehow still standing. "You're not going to believe this, old friend," Silas said, his voice hoarse. "But we just went from having nothing to having everything. All we have to do now is figure out how to stay alive long enough to enjoy it." The desert stretched out around them, vast and indifferent as always. But Silas looked at it now with different eyes. It had tried to kill him. His nephews had tried to kill him. The storm, the coyotes, the heat, everything had conspired to end him. But he'd survived, and more than survived. He'd found treasure beyond imagining. Found it because his nephews had been too greedy and too stupid to realize that sometimes the universe has plans of its own, plans that don't care about what evil men intend. Now all Silas had to do was get home and watch his nephews' faces when they realized the man they'd left to die was about to become the richest man they'd ever met. The discovery of the gold had given Silas new purpose, but it hadn't solved his immediate problems. He was still stranded in the middle of the Devil's Anvil with no water, no supplies, and a horse who could barely walk. The treasure meant nothing if they died out here. Silas forced himself to think practically. Water first. Everything else depended on water. He looked at the landscape the storm had revealed, trying to orient himself. The problem was that the storm had changed everything. Landmarks he'd have used to navigate were gone or altered, buried under new dunes or exposed where there had been cover before. But water followed patterns that storms couldn't change. It followed the low points, the places where ancient geology created channels and seeps. Silas had spent 47 years reading this desert, understanding its moods and secrets. That knowledge was worth more right now than any gold. He studied the exposed rock formations, looking for the telltale signs of water flow, staining on stone the particular kind of erosion that spoke of seasonal flooding, the way certain plants grew. There, about half a mile to the northwest, a cleft in the rock that might lead to one of the seeps he knew existed in this area. Half a mile. With Rusty's leg, it might take them an hour or more. But what choice did they have? Silas took one last look at the buried stagecoach, fixing its location in his mind. The distinctive rock formation behind it, the angle of the slope, the way the exposed roof caught the light. He'd need to find this place again, and soon. For now, he pulled out his pocket knife and carved a mark in the stone near the shelter. 3 deep gouges in the shape of an arrow pointing toward the coach. Then he added his initials, SV. Silas Vance was here. Silas Vance found this. Silas Vance survived. "Come on, boy," he said to Rusty, taking the horse's halter gently. "Let's go find us some water." They moved slowly across the transformed landscape, Rusty limping heavily, Silas's own gait not much better. Every step was agony, but Silas kept them moving. He talked to Rusty as they walked, keeping his voice calm and steady, the way he'd talked to Martha when she was scared or hurting. The horse seemed to take comfort from it, ears swiveling back to catch the familiar voice. "You know what we're going to do when we get home," Silas said. "First thing, I'm putting you in the paddock with about 6 bales of the best alfalfa hay money can buy. Then I'm calling that vet. You remember Doc Wilson? He'll fix up that leg proper. Then you're going to spend the rest of your days doing absolutely nothing but eating and sleeping in the sun. How does that sound?" Rusty nickered softly, as if in agreement. The walk to the rock cleft took longer than Silas had estimated, closer to 90 minutes. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them with merciless intensity. Silas's lips were cracked and bleeding. His tongue felt thick in his mouth. The wound on his arm had stopped bleeding but was starting to throb with a heat that worried him. Infection was setting in. Another problem that needed addressing, but only if he survived long enough for it to matter. When they finally reached the cleft in the rocks, Silas could have wept with relief. There was water. Not much. Just a slow seep that created a small pool in a depression in the stone, but it was water. He let Rusty drink first, watching as the horse lowered his head and drank in long, grateful pulls. Then Silas knelt and cupped his hands, bringing the lukewarm, slightly alkaline water to his mouth. It tasted like heaven. He drank until his stomach protested, then forced himself to stop and rest. Too much water too fast after severe dehydration could make him sick. He waited 10 minutes, then drank again. The headache that had been building behind his eyes began to ease. His thoughts cleared. The world came back into focus. With water in him, Silas could finally think beyond simple survival. The reality of his situation began to crystallize. He'd found the legendary Wells Fargo gold. A fortune that had been lost for nearly 50 years was sitting out there in the desert, waiting to be claimed. But claiming it wouldn't be simple. He needed to get back to town, needed to report the find to the authorities, needed to establish his rights before someone else stumbled onto it or before his nephews. His nephews. Silas felt rage bubble up fresh and hot. They'd tried to kill him, left him out here to die like an unwanted dog. And they'd probably already started moving on his ranch, filing whatever papers they needed to claim his land and assets. In their minds, Uncle Silas was already dead. But he wasn't dead, and when he walked back into town, when he showed up alive with the treasure that would make headlines across the state, Raymond and Carl were going to have a very bad day, a very bad rest of their lives, actually. Silas sat back against the rocks and let himself imagine it, the look on their faces when he walked into the sheriff's office, the scrambling they'd do to explain why they'd been so certain their uncle was dead. The questions that would be asked about how an elderly man ended up stranded in the Devil's Anvil with no supplies during a sandstorm. He could press charges, attempted murder. They'd tried to talk their way out of it, but the hired thugs they'd brought along might not be as loyal when faced with prison time. One of them would talk. And then Raymond and Carl would spend the next 20 years behind bars, watching from prison while Silas lived in comfort on the fortune they'd inadvertently helped him find. The irony was almost too perfect. If they hadn't driven him out here, he never would have sheltered behind that particular dune, never would have been there when the storm uncovered the coach. They'd created the very circumstances that would destroy them. But first, and this was the practical part, the part that reminded Silas why he'd succeeded as a rancher when others had failed. He needed to get home, needed to document everything, needed to make his claim legally bulletproof, and needed to do it quickly, before anyone else discovered what he'd found. Silas looked at the sun, gauging the time, mid-morning, maybe 10 o'clock. The nearest road was, he oriented himself mentally, about 8 miles west. If they walked through the heat of the day, they'd kill themselves. Better to rest here until late afternoon. Let Rusty recover what strength he could, then make the push during the cooler evening hours. 8 miles. With Rusty's leg and his own condition, it would take all night, but they could do it. They'd survived worse in the last 24 hours. 8 miles of walking seemed almost easy by comparison. Silas used the waiting time to tend to his wounds. He washed the coyote bite with water from the seep, wincing at the pain, but knowing infection was the real enemy now. He tore another strip from his shirt. The garment was starting to look more like a rag than clothing, and made a fresh bandage. It wouldn't be enough if infection really took hold, but it was better than nothing. He thought about Martha, about what she'd say if she could see him now. She'd probably laugh. That particular laugh she had when he'd done something simultaneously brave and stupid. Silas Vance, she'd say, "You're the most stubborn man I've ever met. Too stubborn to die, too stubborn to admit when you need help, too stubborn for your own good." But she'd also be proud. He knew that. Proud that he'd protected Rusty. Proud that he'd survived. Proud that he'd held on to his dignity and his principles even when his own family had betrayed him. Martha had always valued those things. Dignity, principle, the kind of strength that didn't need to prove itself to anyone. As the afternoon wore on, Silas made his plans. First priority, get to the road. Second, get a ride into town. Third, go straight to Sheriff Mackenzie's office. The sheriff was a good man, honest, someone Silas had known for 30 years. He'd listen, he'd understand, and he'd make sure Raymond and Carl didn't slip away before justice caught up with them. After that, and this was where things got interesting, Silas needed to establish his legal claim to the gold. He'd need lawyers, probably, good ones, the kind who didn't come cheap. But that wouldn't be a problem anymore. He could afford the best lawyers in the state now. Hell, he could afford the best lawyers in the country if it came to that. The gold would need to be authenticated, catalogued, removed from the site properly. There'd be paperwork, legal filings, probably disputes about ownership rights. The federal government might claim some of it. The state might want a piece. Wells Fargo's corporate descendants might make a claim. It would be complicated, but Silas had time now. Time and resources. Time to do things right. Time to make sure his nephews paid for what they'd done. Time to honor Rusty's loyalty and Martha's memory by using this fortune for good. He thought about the ranch, about what he could do with real money, new fences, new equipment, maybe hire some help, good people who actually cared about the land. Maybe even expand the herd again, return the place to something like its former glory. Martha would like that. She'd always loved seeing the ranch full of life. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Silas felt energy returning to his body. The water had worked its magic. He was still hurting, still exhausted, but he could move. He could walk. He could get them home. "All right, Rusty," he said, pulling himself to his feet and offering the horse one last drink from the seep. "Time to finish this. 8 miles to the road. We can do 8 miles. We fought off coyotes all night. We survived a sandstorm. We found a legendary treasure. 8 miles is nothing." Rusty raised his head from the water and looked at Silas with those dark, patient eyes. The horse's leg was still bad, but he could walk. He would walk. Together, they would make it. as they started west toward the road, toward civilization, toward justice and vindication, and a future neither of them could have imagined 24 hours ago. Silas felt something shift in his chest. Not just hope. Hope had been there all along, stubborn and unyielding. This was different. This was certainty. He would make it home. He would reclaim his life. He would see his nephews pay for their betrayal, and he would spend whatever time he had left making sure that Rusty lived out his days in peace and comfort. The desert stretched out around them, beautiful and terrible in the slanting afternoon light. Silas had always respected this land, understood its power and its indifference, but now he felt something more: gratitude. The desert had tried to kill him, yes, but it had also given him a gift beyond measure, had revealed secrets it had kept for 50 years. And Silas Vance, 72 years old, left for dead by his own family, was about to become the richest man anyone in town had ever met. The walk took all night, just as Silas had predicted, 8 miles across broken desert terrain in the dark, with only starlight to guide them and Rusty limping beside him every step of the way. Silas's legs moved on autopilot, one foot in front of the other, driven by pure determination when strength ran out. They reached the highway just as dawn was breaking, a 2-lane strip of asphalt cutting through the desert like a ribbon of dark water. Silas stood at the edge of the road and felt emotion well up in his throat. They'd made it, against all odds, against everything his nephews had intended. They'd survived. Rusty stood beside him, head lowered with exhaustion, sides heaving. The horse had given everything he had, pushed through pain and exhaustion because Silas had asked it of him, because that's what Rusty did. That's what he'd always done. "Thank you," Silas whispered, resting his forehead against the horse's neck. "Thank you for not giving up on me." A truck appeared in the distance, heading their direction. Silas stepped out into the road and raised his arms, waving. The truck, a rancher's pickup that had seen better days, slowed and stopped. The driver, a weathered man about Silas's age, leaned out the window with concern written across his face. "Good Lord, are you all right?" the man asked. "You look like you've been through hell." "Something like that," Silas said, his voice hoarse. "I need a ride into town, me and my horse." The driver didn't ask questions. That was the way of ranch country. You helped first and asked for explanations later. He had a horse trailer attached to his truck, empty except for some hay bales. Within 15 minutes, they had Rusty loaded and were heading toward town. "Name's Ed Brennan," the driver said as they drove. "You're Silas Vance, aren't you? Got the spread out near the Red Rocks?" "That's me. Heard talk you'd gone missing. Your nephews have been telling folks you wandered off during the storm. Said they were organizing a search party." Silas felt cold rage settle in his gut. Of course they had. Playing the concerned family members, establishing the narrative before anyone could question it. They were probably planning to find his body in a few days, somewhere easily explainable. An old man who got confused and walked into the desert. A tragic accident. No one would question it. Except Silas wasn't dead, and he had a story to tell that would destroy them. "Take me to the sheriff's office," Silas said. "Not the hospital, not my ranch. The sheriff's office first." Ed glanced at him, taking in the torn clothes, the bloody bandage on his arm, the hollow look in Silas's eyes. "You sure? You look like you need a doctor." "I need the law first. The doctor can wait." They pulled into town an hour later. Word must have spread fast because there were already people gathering, drawn by the sight of Ed Brennan's truck with its unexpected passenger. Silas saw faces he'd known for decades, neighbors and friends, all staring with a mixture of shock and relief. And there, standing outside the general store, were Raymond and Carl. They'd frozen when the truck appeared, their faces going white as they recognized the man in the passenger seat. The man who was supposed to be dead. Silas looked at them through the truck window, meeting their eyes directly, and he saw it all in that moment. The shock, the fear, the dawning realization that they'd made a catastrophic mistake. They started moving, trying to get to their own truck. But Ed was already pulling up to the sheriff's office, and people were gathering around, asking questions. Sheriff Tom Mackenzie emerged from his office, a tall man with iron-gray hair and a reputation for fairness that had kept him in office for 3 terms. He took one look at Silas, and his expression hardened. "Silas Vance," he said, "your nephews reported you missing 2 days ago, said you wandered off during the storm." "I didn't wander anywhere, Tom. Silas said, climbing down from the truck with difficulty. They drove me out to the Devil's Anvil and left me there, them and 2 hired men. They took my horse. He gestured to Rusty, being carefully unloaded from the trailer. And they left us both to die in that storm. The crowd had gone silent. Sheriff Mackenzie's eyes narrowed. That's a serious accusation. I've got a coyote bite on my arm to prove I spent the night fighting for my life. I've got my horse's bad leg that got worse because they forced him to walk 5 miles into the desert. And I've got 2 nephews who are about to run because they know exactly what they did. Sure, enough. Raymond and Carl were backing toward their truck, faces pale, movements jerky with panic. The sheriff raised his hand. Raymond and Carl, Vance, don't you move. I've got questions for both of you. Silas watched his nephews freeze, watched them realize there was no escape, no easy way out of this. The web they'd woven was about to trap them, and there was nothing they could do but watch it happen. The confrontation Silas had been planning during his long walk through the desert was about to begin. The sheriff's office became an impromptu courtroom as more townspeople gathered outside, word spreading through the small community like wildfire. Silas sat in a wooden chair. A doctor called in to examine his wounds while he gave his statement. Raymond and Carl sat on the opposite side of the room, flanked by 2 deputies, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. They wanted my land, Silas said, his voice steady and clear despite his exhaustion. They'd been pressuring me for months to sell or sign over power of attorney. When I refused, they took matters into their own hands. Brought 2 hired men. I don't know their names, but I'd recognize them, and drove me out to the Devil's Anvil. Left me there with my lame horse during a sandstorm. They figured the desert would do their work for them. Make it look like an accident. That's a damned lie. Carl burst out, but his voice shook. He's confused. He's an old man who got lost during the storm. Then explain this, Silas said, pulling back his makeshift bandage to show the coyote bite. Explain how I fought off a pack of coyotes all night. Explain why I have sand from the Devil's Anvil in every crease of my clothes. Explain why my horse's leg is torn up from being forced to walk miles on injured tissue. Sheriff Mackenzie wrote everything down, his expression growing darker with each detail. We'll find those hired men. If your story checks out, and I suspect it will, we're looking at attempted murder charges. Raymond leaned forward, desperation in his eyes. Uncle Silas, please, we can work this out. We made a mistake, but we're family. Family doesn't leave each other to die. Silas said coldly, you stopped being family the moment you drove away from that desert. All this over a rundown ranch? The sheriff asked. You 2 were willing to kill for 300 acres. This was the moment. Silas had been saving it, letting the gravity of the attempted murder charge sink in first. Now he was ready to twist the knife. About that, Silas said, a smile tugging at his cracked lips. While I was out there fighting for my life, the storm uncovered something interesting. You remember the old stories about the Wells Fargo coach that disappeared in 1875? The sheriff's eyebrows rose. The payroll shipment. That's a legend, Silas. Was a legend, Silas corrected. The storm blew away 5 feet of sand and exposed the roof of that coach. It was buried right where I took shelter. Inside are 3 crates of gold bars, the lost Wells Fargo payroll. I saw them with my own eyes, held one in my hands. The room went absolutely silent. Raymond and Carl's faces had gone from white to gray, their mouths hanging open. They looked like men watching their worst nightmare unfold in real time. I carved my initials at the site, Silas continued. Marked the location. I'm filing a claim today with the proper authorities. Finder's rights on federal land. My lawyers, and I can afford the best now, will handle the details. But by every legal measure I can think of, that gold is mine. How much? Someone in the crowd asked. The legend said 100,000 in 1875 gold, Silas said. At today's prices? Several $1 million, conservatively. The sheriff let out a low whistle. Raymond made a sound like a wounded animal. The irony was too perfect, too cruel. They'd tried to kill him for his modest ranch, and in doing so, they'd accidentally made him rich beyond their wildest dreams. So let me see if I have this straight, Sheriff Mackenzie said, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. These 2 tried to murder you for your land. In the process, they inadvertently led you to a fortune that would have remained hidden forever if not for their actions. And now they get to spend the next 20 years in prison, watching you become one of the richest men in the state. That about sums it up, Silas agreed. Carl stood suddenly, face red with rage and denial. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening. We planned everything." "Shut up," Raymond hissed, but it was too late. Carl had just confirmed their premeditation in front of a room full of witnesses. The sheriff stood. "Raymond and Carl Vance, you're under arrest for attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent, which I strongly suggest you exercise at this point." As the deputies led his nephews away in handcuffs, Silas felt something release in his chest. Not triumph, exactly. This wasn't a moment for celebration. 2 men were going to prison, 2 men who shared his blood, however tainted that connection had become. But it was justice. It was right. It was the natural consequence of their choices. Outside, someone had taken Rusty to the veterinary clinic. Silas needed to get there, needed to make sure his faithful companion received the care he deserved. But first, he had one more thing to do. He looked at Sheriff Mackenzie and said, "I want to buy the First National Bank, the one that holds the mortgages on most of the property in this county, including whatever my nephews own. Can you help me find out who to contact about that?" The sheriff smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who appreciated poetic justice when he saw it. "I think I can arrange that, Silas. I think I can arrange that just fine." 3 months later, Silas stood on his porch and watched the sun set over his land. The same view he'd been watching for 47 years. But everything was different now. Everything had changed. The ranch looked better than it had in decades. New fences ran straight and true along the property lines. The barn had a new roof. The house had been repaired, repainted, restored to something approaching what it had looked like when Martha was alive. Not that Silas was trying to recreate the past. You couldn't bring back what was gone. But he was honoring it, maintaining it, showing respect for the life they'd built together. In the paddock, Rusty grazed peacefully alongside 2 younger horses Silas had purchased. The old horse's leg had healed as much as it was going to. Doc Wilson had done good work, and the months of rest and proper care had made a remarkable difference. Rusty still limped, probably always would, but he was comfortable, content. He'd earned his retirement 1,000 times over, and Silas made sure he wanted for nothing. The legal proceedings surrounding the Wells Fargo gold had been complex, just as Silas had anticipated. There had been claims and counterclaims, hearings and depositions, lawyers from 3 different states arguing about ownership rights. But in the end, Silas's claim had held. Finders' rights on federal land, no living descendants of the original owners, possession being 9/10 of the law. The gold was his, minus the government's cut, which was substantial but still left Silas with more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. He'd been careful with it. Invested wisely, set up trusts, made sure that when his time came, the money would go to causes Martha would have approved of. Scholarships for ranch kids, funding for rural veterinary services, preservation of open lands. He'd bought the bank, as promised, and had quietly forgiven several mortgages for families he knew were struggling. He'd done it anonymously, but word got out anyway. That was the nature of small towns. Raymond and Carl were serving 15 years each at the state penitentiary, reduced from the initial 25-year sentences because they'd pleaded guilty. The hired men had testified against them, cutting deals for themselves. The whole sordid story had made headlines for weeks. Silas tried not to think about them much. They'd made their choices. They were living with the consequences. As for Silas himself, he'd settled into a new routine. He'd hired help for the ranch. Good people, a young couple who actually cared about the land and the animals. They lived in the new cabin he'd built on the north end of the property, and they did most of the heavy work now, letting Silas supervise and advise rather than breaking his back at an age when he should be taking it easier. But he still did the morning chores himself, still fed Rusty personally every day, still walked the fence lines when the weather was good, checking for problems, staying connected to the land that had defined his life. He was wealthy now, but he was still a rancher at heart. That hadn't changed. That would never change. The sound of a truck on the gravel drive pulled him from his thoughts. It was Ed Brennan, the man who'd given Silas that crucial ride into town 3 months ago. They'd become friends since then, meeting for coffee twice a week to talk about weather and cattle prices and the small dramas of ranch life. "Evening, Silas," Ed called, climbing out of his truck. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're settling in." "Settling in fine," Silas said. "Coffee?" They sat on the porch, the newly repaired porch that didn't sag anymore, and watched the light fade from the sky. This was what Silas valued now. These quiet moments with a friend, these simple pleasures that didn't require money or status or anything except being alive and present. You ever think about what would have happened if that storm hadn't uncovered the gold? Ed asked eventually. Silas considered the question. Sometimes. But I don't think it would have mattered as much as people think. I'd have survived anyway. I'd have found a way, and Raymond and Carl would still be going to prison. The gold just made it more interesting. More interesting. Ed repeated with a chuckle. That's one way to put it. You're probably the most famous man in 3 states right now. I'd rather be unknown and alive, Silas said. I'd rather be right here, on this porch, drinking coffee with a friend. That's wealth enough for any man. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness fell. Somewhere in the paddock, Rusty nickered softly. The sound made Silas smile. That horse had saved his life just by being there, by giving him something worth protecting when everything else seemed lost. As Ed drove away an hour later, Silas remained on the porch, alone with his thoughts. He thought about Martha, about how she'd have handled all this attention and wealth. She probably would have donated most of it immediately, kept just enough to fix up the ranch and help a few neighbors, and gone right back to her regular life. She'd never cared much for fancy things. He thought about the 2 days in the Devil's Anvil, the storm, the coyotes, the desperate fight for survival. The memories were already taking on a dreamlike quality, as if they'd happened to someone else, but the lessons remained. The understanding that life could turn on a moment, that family wasn't always who you were born to, but who stood by you when things got hard. That sometimes the universe had a sense of justice that human plans couldn't account for. Silas stood and walked down to the paddock. Rusty came to the fence immediately, expecting his evening sugar cube. Silas obliged, watching the horse's soft lips take the treat from his palm, feeling that warm breath against his skin. "We made it, old friend," he said softly. "We actually made it." The horse looked at him with those dark, patient eyes, and Silas could have sworn Rusty understood. Understood everything. The journey they'd been on together, the second chance they'd been given, the peace they'd earned. Silas Vance was 72 years old, one of the richest men in the state, and living on the same land he'd worked for nearly 5 decades. His nephews were in prison, his horse was healthy, his ranch was thriving, and every morning when he woke up, he was grateful for one more day. He walked back to the house as the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had guided him through that terrible night in the desert. Inside, he'd heat up some supper, maybe read for a while before bed. Tomorrow he'd start the same routines again. Feed the horses, check the cattle, walk the land. It was a simple life, a good life, the kind of life worth fighting for, worth surviving for, worth living for as long as he had breath in his body. And every sunset, he'd stand on his porch and remember the storm, the struggle, the discovery, and the journey home. Remember that sometimes the things meant to destroy you end up saving you. Remember that giving up was never an option, not when there was still life to be lived and promises to be kept. Silas smiled and went inside, closing the door on another day, looking forward to the next.